Over the past day, 3 platoons have been eliminated and more than a platoon have been wounded. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine shared details about the fighting for Pokrovsk. Thus, the defense forces destroyed exactly 60 Russian assault troops who, under the cover of fog, tried to advance toward the city center and gain a foothold. Another 23 people were wounded. As a result, the occupiers' attempt to break through failed. At the same time, the enemy is still holding the old positions they occupied several days earlier. According to the command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, search and assault operations are currently underway, and the entire city effectively remains a gray zone.
The enemy, who entered through the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk, has already established a certain bridgehead there. The bridgehead is already being supplied logistically. Accordingly, the gray zone is very large. Today it covers most of the city, although the lines on the northern edges of the city in the northern part of Pokrovsk are currently being held by our paratroopers in particular.
Another direction that regularly appears in military reports is the Kupiansk area. Despite Gerasimov's report about encircling around 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers there, our command denies this information. On the contrary, they are reporting successes and the advance of the defense forces.
Today, it has not yet been possible to push the enemy out of Kupiansk itself, but the counter-attacking actions demonstrated by the defense forces today are steady advances. These are not sudden counter-offensive operations, but rather counter-attacking actions. Nevertheless, this is allowing our defense forces to regain some tactical positions that were lost several weeks or even months ago, right in the city of Kupiansk itself.
The Russians have also become more active in the south of our country. The Zaporizhzhia direction, from where the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine was drawing reserves to Pokrovsk, has been bringing rather alarming news for several weeks. However, the situation has now been stabilized.
The active offensive operation that they declared just a week ago is no longer taking place. Now, we are striking and using significant firepower against their reserves. What is especially important is that we have now started destroying the railway that supplies these groups.
Analysts say the situation in Zaporizhzhia remains difficult. The enemy continues to concentrate forces and, using sabotage groups, infiltrates villages under Ukrainian control near the Kakhovka reservoir. However, these attacks repeatedly end in failure.
The Russians once again failed to take Stsenohirk or even the multi-story buildings in the southern part of the settlement. Only part of the buildings are under enemy control. Additional pressure on Stsenohirk comes from enemy attempts to break through on the road to Horivka. North of the seaside Dakhas is a large open area, so the Russians don't try to hold it. Instead, taking risks, they move further north, where there's a building and some kind of trench line.
But as the enemy advances in open fields, thanks to our artillery, they suffer colossal losses there, which is why the occupiers are no longer given vehicles and are sent into the assault exclusively on foot. At the same time, our defense forces managed to strike not only along the front line, but also deep in the Russian rear. In particular, the past day was marked by an unprecedented event. Special Operations Forces used a long-range drone to shoot down a Russian Mi-8 military helicopter right over Russian territory. As noted by the agency, this marks a new chapter in the war, with capabilities for the Ukrainian armed forces never seen before.
The point is that previously, Ukrainians shot down helicopters in the air using regular FPVs. The range is usually only a few dozen kilometers at most, if the warhead weighs about 1.5 kilograms. But in this case, we see that it wasn't necessary to ram the drone into the helicopter, thanks to the powerful warhead. On the other hand, as you can see, this happened at a different altitude where regular FPVs might not be able to reach. And which is very important, as some sources seem to say, though this still needs to be clarified, this is happening at a very long distance. In this case, we're talking about the Rostov region, the area of Kutenikovo. And what is Kutenikovo? Well, in fact, it's 200 kilometers from the line of contact.
The occupied territories were also affected. Part of the Donetsk region was plunged into a total blackout, which partially paralyzed the command of Russian forces. Among more than a dozen successful strikes, the explosions in Dokuchayevsk are particularly noteworthy. Analysts are still debating whether the nighttime glow was the result of a strike on a power plant or an ammunition depot.
Whatever it was, either way, it's ultimately a blow to logistics. Because if a substation is destroyed, the group loses electricity. If the strike hits an ammunition depot, the group loses shells. This is important for the group that is currently advancing in Donetsk region. In other words, at the very least, it slows down their offensive potential.
At the same time, fighters on the ground confirm this information. In fact, due to intensified strikes on Russian logistics in Donetsk region, assault units have lost constant support. They have been cut off from reserves and weapon supplies and have lost momentum in their advance in Pokrovsk as well.
Pokrovsk played a cruel joke on the occupiers. While the enemy threw all its forces into desperate attempts to take control of the ruins of the city destroyed by the Russian army, the Ukrainian armed forces launched a counterattack 200 kilometers to the north in Kupiansk. Enemy forces there suffered huge losses according to reports. The Ukrainian command reports that they were forced to retreat.
The enemy was cleared out from the northwestern outskirts, they're no longer there, and that's a huge achievement.
In fact, the Ukrainian armed forces have cut off the Russian invaders in the northern part of Kupiansk from their main supplies of provisions, cannon fodder and ammunition. Further, according to Commander Fedorenko, his unit and an adjacent unit set about locating the remaining Russian sabotage groups and clearing them out. As of now, the operation is almost complete.
If you open a map that more or less accurately reflects the line of contact, you'll see that the enemy has been pushed back quite significantly in the northern outskirts. And what does that mean? The farther we push the enemy from the northern outskirts of the city of Kupiansk, the less space they have to send their sabotage groups directly into the city of Kupiansk.
However, the Ukrainian armed forces, unfortunately, cannot boast of such brilliant successes on another hottest section of the front near Pokrovsk or in the city itself. Russian assaults there do not stop, day or night. It seems the Kremlin has thrown all its forces into capturing the city. Nevertheless, despite all their efforts, the Ukrainian command notes that our defenders are heroically holding the line.
The situation around Pokrovsk is extremely difficult, but still, we are somehow holding on.
According to the military, most of the city is now in the so-called gray zone. This is when control over the territory constantly shifts from one side to the other, and fighting takes place for every building entrance. Stsenohirk also fully understands the complexity of the situation in Pokrovsk. In particular, the commander-in-chief stated that the AFU units and other components of the defense forces continue to carry out their tasks in the Pokrovsk-Mirnorad agglomeration area, despite the fact that enemy activity remains high in this sector.
Enemy activity remains high, but the sensitive coordination and cohesion of our units help us to resist it. We are working to ensure the continuity of our logistics and are taking measures to disrupt the enemy's supply routes.
Nevertheless, the situation in the Pokrovsk direction remains extremely difficult. The enemy, disregarding their losses, continues to assault AFU positions, the commander-in-chief shares in his operational update.
In just the past 4 days, total enemy losses in the Pokrovsk direction amounted to 487 personnel. Of these, 350 are irrecoverable losses. The exchange fund is being replenished with captured Russian soldiers.
For security reasons, the Ukrainian command does not disclose further details about the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. However, they can share information about completed special operations on the front line. For example, the head of the main intelligence directorate, Kyrylo Budanov, gave an interview in which he revealed details of one of the most daring airborne operations by the GRU, during which special forces, having secured certain positions behind enemy lines, managed to break through and establish a full-fledged ground corridor. At that time, Budanov himself was nearby and personally directed the operation.
Why was such an operation necessary, and why was it carried out in this particular way? Because the situation was extremely tense and critical. I want to remind you that all of this happened against the backdrop of official statements from the Russian Federation about having taken the city. When Gerasimov reported to Putin that the city had been captured, and here you need to understand what the situation was like at that moment. Nothing else would have worked. What we did allowed us to win precious time, so that the main units of the armed forces could calmly, or as calmly as possible, approach the city to reinforce it. Let's put it that way.
It is possible that even at this very moment, GRU special units are carrying out another special operation in the Pokrovsk direction. Military public channels are already reporting on the clearing of Pokrovsk, strikes on enemy supply lines, and the establishment of alternative logistics routes now for the Ukrainian armed forces. So all we can do is wait for official confirmation of good news from the Ukrainian command.
Russian occupiers continue their attempts to encircle Ukrainian forces in the area of Pokrovsk and Mirnovrad in the Donetsk region. But the Ukrainian armed forces continue to hold these cities. Russian soldiers are complaining that a new tactic is being used against them. But the main reason for the occupiers' troubles is themselves, since the Russian army is now recruiting all sorts of riffraff.
We are currently on assignment in Pokrovsk. Right now they're taking everyone on contract, whether you're a drunk, a drug addict, or an athlete. The word Ukrainian is used to describe something or someone that comes from Ukraine, which is a country located in Eastern Europe. It can refer to the people who live there, the language they speak, or the culture and traditions that are unique to Ukraine.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Sabotage groups infiltrate behind Russian army lines and simply wipe out inexperienced and often drunken occupiers. Another factor in the successful operations in this direction is the destruction of ammunition supplies that the Russians try to deliver to their personnel using robotic systems. Russian soldiers are forced to advance practically in hand-to-hand combat. And despite constant pressure from the Ukrainian armed forces, it has been possible to hold Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad.
We are able to hold out because we continue to maintain our positions in the areas of Rodinske and Prishin, thereby preventing the Russians from closing the pincers of an operational semi-encirclement, and thus ensuring the logistics for our garrison operating there.
The Security Service of Ukraine has recorded that the occupiers are even trying to storm Pokrovsk using local residents as human shields.
A woman, a man and a child, 13 years old. That's what they told you. You civilians, take them with you and take them with you for the sweep there, damn it. Let them go ahead of you. And check for a reward.
The occupiers forced the victims to go in front during the clearing of buildings in the city. Such actions by the Russian occupation groups violate Article 28 of the Geneva Convention on the Protection of Civilians During War and are classified as a war crime. In
Pokrovsk itself, the number of firefights is increasing and enemy losses from direct fire are growing. And it is possible that Ukrainian defenders will withdraw from their positions within the boundaries of Mirnohrad. This will make it possible to redirect the freed-up resources to holding the bottleneck up to the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration. It seems that despite various tricks by the AFU, they may still be able to hold their positions in this direction for quite some time.
Let the military decide how exactly to proceed, whether to continue defending Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad or to carry out certain maneuvering actions by withdrawing to other lines and positions, avoiding the operational encirclement of our forces and assets.
Taking advantage of the fact that Ukraine is sending additional forces to Pokrovsk, the enemy has intensified offensive actions in the Zaporizhzhia direction. According to deep state analysts, the Russian army has advanced near Vesely, Vysoke, and Zatishia. The strategically important cities of Orikhiv and Huliaipole are at risk of being encircled. Russian FPV drones are forcing residents of Huliaipole to leave the city. In recent weeks, the situation with UAVs has escalated to the maximum.
Now the situation has fundamentally changed. In August, the Russians moved even closer to the city and the intensity of shelling increased. FPV drones have started flying near the city. There are so many of them that the sky is red from their presence, say both police officers and soldiers, and it was precisely in August that the evacuation intensified.
According to analysts, the occupying forces are only no more than 8 kilometers. Russia is not trying to advance northeast of Huliaipole in order to isolate the city and cut it off from key logistical routes. However, the Ukrainian armed forces are blocking these attempts.
Russian assaults have become even more massive and ruthless. First and foremost for the Russians themselves. In just 3 days, the Ukrainian armed forces have already destroyed a third enemy column, which was advancing to attack Ukrainian positions. The day before, it became known that the defense forces destroyed a concentration of manpower belonging to Russia's 51st Army near Pokrovsk. The incident occurred in the settlement of Zatishok in the Donetsk region. As reported by the Special Operations Forces on their Telegram channel, at the moment the drone was used, enemy troops from 2 brigades were concentrated in the building, tasked with encircling the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration from the north. At the same time, analysts are highlighting other successes of the defense forces. In this direction,
specifically in the settlements of Krasny Lyman and Rodinsky. As far as I know, Rodinsky has been almost completely cleared of enemy presence. Additionally, fighting is taking place in the area of Kotlinov and 1st of May. Peshatrovnya. There is also rather alarming information regarding the settlement of Rivne. It is located right between Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. There the enemy tried to slip through our defensive lines. This attack was repelled.
Speaking about the situation in Pokrovsk itself, experts note that, as before, the occupiers are aiming to cut off the logistics of the Ukrainian armed forces, but as before, they have not succeeded in doing so. At the same time, both President Zelensky and Commander-in-Chief Syrsky are openly commenting on the situation.
Yes, the enemy has entered the city. Yes, the enemy is trying to attack the central and northern parts of the city. However, we are saying that first and foremost, the main defensive operation, the defensive operation of our units in Pokrovsk is ongoing. Today, various scenarios are being drawn up about how this battle might end. We will not discuss them today, not because we do not know or do not want to. We fully understand that the commanders on the ground, as well as those higher up, are working through various scenarios, even the most negative developments.
However, according to experts, it is still far too early to talk about negative scenarios. Moreover, our general staff, when describing the situation in Pokrovsk, notes that the situation has been partially stabilized and in some areas even successes have been demonstrated.
Speaking about the actions of the 425th Separate Assault Regiment, Syrsky apparently refers to another raid by the regiment's assault troops, which was shown in a video published by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The Ukrainian channel Infectum geolocated the video and commented on it as follows. Assault groups of the Skelia Regiment are conducting a raid on the northern part of Pokrovsk, clearing out individual Russian positions in the private sector and dispersing throughout the city. Interestingly, the groups managed to link up with fighters who are holding the city council building in the city center, already beyond the railway that divides the city in half and serves as a kind of barrier. In other words, the previous video, where Skelia groups moved through half the city to the city council, wasn't just a flag for show, but a full-fledged capture and holding of the position.
So, despite all the statements from the Russian command claiming that Russia confidently controls Pokrovsk, Ukrainian fighters are not only able to enter the city council building in the southern part of the city and wave a flag, but also to set up a full-fledged strongpoint there. This also applies to the recent triumphant advance of a Russian column into the city from the Donetsk direction.
Here is that well-known column which has already been dubbed the Mad Max column after the famous movie. Russian propagandists replayed it countless times, but in the end they forgot to show the most important part, the finale. How did the fighting end for these brutes? In fact, it ended in a rout.
But even that wasn't enough for the Russians. And just yesterday they advanced in a similar column to attack Kostiantynivka. The result was identical.
The Russians are trying to impose a chaotic tactic of assault raids, hiding behind the weather as their last shield. But now even the fog is not always an ally, and sometimes it's a trap. The Ukrainian armed forces use, among other things, thermal imaging and optical surveillance equipment, drones with artificial intelligence and rapid coordination between reconnaissance and firepower. That's why those who head into the fog are actually walking toward their own doom. The Ukrainian army demonstrates not only technological superiority, but also operational maturity. 2 columns, 2 attempts at a surprise offensive, and both times Russia loses everything. Equipment, infantry, the ability to maneuver.
While repelling massive attacks on Pokrovsk, the Joint Forces operation also keeps an eye on another important point on the war map, Kupiansk. It is there that Russia is pushing, trying to tie down our reserves in the Kharkiv region and prevent their redeployment to the Donbas. However, the Russians have not achieved the desired result there.
At present, our defense forces are systematically and methodically clearing the area, those territories near Kupiansk, where the enemy had infiltrated over a fairly long period of time. Regarding Kupiansk, I have a strong hope that we will succeed. Maybe not tomorrow, but in the near future we will be able to fully stabilize the situation in this sector of the front.
And at the same time to undermine the Russian rear, experts add. And there are already the first signs of this. In particular, yesterday's strike on the port of Novorossiysk has been called by many a real turning point. Both in the war and in the collapse of the Russian economy,
Ukrainian forces have reached a new milestone. For the first time, they successfully struck Russia's main oil export gateway in the south with a massive attack, namely the port of Novorossiysk. Drones hit the site, but most importantly, so did missiles. The drones distracted the air defenses, while Flamingo-type missiles, those are the only ones I can imagine causing such flashes and explosions, delivered the decisive blow. On your screens are videos from local residents showing powerful explosions in several areas of the port.
Like the ports on the Baltic, Novorossiysk remains a key location for Russia when it comes to oil trade. It is also one of the most heavily protected sites by air defense systems. If our missiles manage to bypass these systems, we can confidently say that there will soon be a significant increase in explosions in Russia.